You know, the first foundational truth we learn about pursuing God is that we need to start by trusting in Jesus. And the reason why we need to trust in Jesus is because we all have this problem called sin. And sin stands in the way of our relationship with God. It blocks us from connecting with God the way that we want to. But some of you might be thinking, well, come on, I know I'm not perfect, but I'm not that bad. I mean, I've never killed anyone or anything. So is my sin really that big of a deal? Will my sin really block me from having a relationship with God? Well, let's begin by first asking, what is sin? Well, it's kind of a churchy word, but in simplest terms, sin is just choosing our own path instead of God's. It's trusting and acting on our own opinions or feelings instead of trusting and acting on God's truth, which is revealed to us in the Bible. And when you begin to look at the Bible, what God does is he kind of lays out what some of this sin might look like in our life. What does it look like when we choose our own path? Look what it says in the New Testament in the book of Galatians chapter 5, starting in verse 19. It says, when you follow the desires of your sinful nature, the results are very clear. Sexual immorality, impurity, lustful pleasure, idolatry. And then it goes on later and says hostility, quarreling, jealousy, outbursts of anger, selfish ambition, dissension, division, envy, drunkenness. Yeah, look at this list. Some of those things sound pretty bad, and you might think, well, I haven't done all those things, but I imagine that most of us would admit that we've probably done some of those. But then when you look in the book of Matthew, you get to see what Jesus actually said about sin. What did Jesus say about what sin looks like in our life? And he even raised the standard even higher. Look what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 5, starting in verse 22. He said, you have heard that our ancestors were told you shouldn't murder, and if you commit murder, you're subject to judgment. But look what Jesus says, but I say, even if you're angry with someone, you're subject to judgment. So Jesus says, even if you're just angry with someone, it's like you've committed murder. And then in verse 27, it says, you've heard the commandment that says you shouldn't commit adultery. But I say, anyone who even looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. And so you can start to see that, yeah, probably all of us have sinned more than we realize. That's why the Bible says this in Romans chapter 3, verse 23, for everyone has sinned. We all fall short of God's glorious standard. And what is God's glorious standard? Well, again, back in Matthew chapter 5, Jesus tells us this. He says in Matthew 5:48, he says, but you are to be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect. Jesus says, okay, here is the standard. You need to be perfect. And not like human perfect, like God perfect. And here's the reason why God's standard is perfect holiness. It's because he is perfectly holy. And so because of that, he can't allow anything less into his presence. We can't connect with God, and we certainly can't be in heaven if we are less than perfect. So you see, yeah, if you compare yourself to the standard of other people, the standard of what the world says, well, then you're probably pretty good. You might not be that bad. But if you compare yourself to God's standard, which is perfection, all of us fall short. There's a great little picture of this in the Old Testament in the book of Isaiah chapter 6. This is the prophet Isaiah, a really good guy, and yet he gets this little glimpse into heaven and he sees God. He has this vision of God. And look what it says in chapter 6, starting in verse 1. He sees God, and it says that he was sitting on a lofty throne, and the train of his robe filled the temple, and attending him were mighty seraphim. Those are angels. And here's what they were saying to each other: holy, holy, holy is the Lord. You see, the angels were acknowledging that God is holy. And Isaiah could see this as well. And so in verse 5, here's what he said. Then I said, it's all over. I am doomed, for I am a sinful man, and I have filthy lips, and I live among a people with filthy lips, and yet I have seen the King. You see, Isaiah says, I am toast. I am doomed because I am imperfect, I am unholy, and yet I'm in the presence of a holy God. Remember, this is a prophet of God saying this. This is a very good guy, and yet he said he couldn't even stand to be in God's presence because he was so filthy. You see, part of what makes heaven so great is the fact that you're in God's presence, and in God's presence, there is absolute perfection, no sin whatsoever. And so because of that, God can't allow your sin and mine to come in and ruin it. If he did that, if he allowed sinfulness into his presence, he would be unjust and he would be unloving in doing so. You see, the reality is all sin, whether it's big or little, it all must be dealt with justly. So hey, I'm sure you're a nice person, but unless you're perfect, no, you can't be in God's presence on your own. You must find a solution to this problem of sin. But the good news is there is a solution, and that solution is Jesus. Why don't you go ahead and pause now and take a look at these questions?